Want to segue into a really, I don't even really know how to describe it, dispiriting story, an extremely important story as the intersection of mass incarceration and the ability and the right to get an abortion, how those two things are crossing over in ways that haven't been reported that much. But thankfully, the Prison Policy Initiative has looked into this, and we want to talk more about all of this with Wanda Bertram, who's a spokesperson with the Prison Policy Initiative. Wanda, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, really happy to have you here. I mean, I felt this was a landmark bit of research that you all were able to do about probation, parole, and the ability to access abortion care. It's almost difficult to know how to start here. We're 2 years away from the Dobbs decision. Give us a sense of maybe the broad picture of how people who are on probation and parole are affected in terms of their ability to access abortion care.
Right. Well, there are nationwide, we know that there are about 800,000 women who are on probation and parole. And for those who don't know, these are different systems. Probation is an alternative to incarceration. It's an alternative type of sentence. Parole is a type of is part of your prison sentence that you serve when you've been released early. So between those two systems, you've got about 800,000 women. We don't know because the government data doesn't show us the number of trans people or gender nonconforming people who are under these systems, unfortunately. We also don't have good data on the number of juveniles under juvenile probation or juvenile parole. But we did some analysis on to look at how many of these hundreds of thousands of women are going to be potentially blocked from getting abortion care out of state if they live in states that don't that have abortion bans or abortion restrictions, unless they can receive explicit permission from their supervising officer. Now, the reason that you might have to do this is because in 41 states, where there are these abortion restrictions, it is a standard condition of probation, parole, or both that people on those programs cannot leave the state, even the county sometimes, without getting explicit permission. And what we found is that about 85% of women under these systems are probably going to face having to get permission from their officers if they want to leave the state to get abortion care.
Wow, I mean, there's so many different elements to this that I want to speak to, but I think maybe the first is just the idea of getting permission, because I think a lot of people maybe who don't know that much about the criminal legal system might say, like, well, of course, wouldn't they just like give them permission if they needed to have this health care? But I think that's likely not the case.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different aspects to talk about with that, right? For one thing, we know that the states with the strictest abortion laws, typically states in the Deep South, are also the states that happen to have some of the highest numbers of people who are on probation and parole, and sometimes the strictest rules on probation and parole. Right? This is not a coincidence. These are states where the governments have taken a very punitive stance towards a population that I should note is disproportionately Black. It's overwhelmingly poor. Majority of people under these systems are make under $20,000 a year, right? So, so and when it comes to asking permission, for one thing, who wants to ask a supervising officer's permission to get an abortion, much less disclose that they're pregnant and that they plan to do that in a state where those laws exist, right? And you know what people on these systems say is you can have a good officer, you can have a bad officer, right? You can have somebody who's trying their best to help you put your life together and make your life better, or you can have someone whose sole mission as a probation or parole officer is to supervise you and to catch you in a mistake so that you are sent back to jail or prison. And if you're on probation or you're on parole, you often don't want to take that chance to find out by asking if you can go get a controversial medical procedure.
And, it feels like one aspect of that as well is that it just sort of exacerbates the public health crisis, in conjunction with the criminalization issue, because if you don't want to ask and people either decide to take something into their own hands or just say, I'm going to go to another state, that then you're sort of forced to balance between whether or not to risk your freedom or risk your health.
That's right. Yeah, and it's that's what's so concerning about this is that people might choose not to tell their supervision officer and might go to a different state regardless. That might lead to them being criminalized for that behavior, right? Or they might choose to seek abortions within their state illegally, right? And that's also something that, because of these bans, has become much more dangerous. Uh, and um, and I worry in particular about um, people who are on electronic monitors. This is a system that's becoming more and more common throughout the U.S. I believe around 200,000 people now are under
Hmm.
electronic monitors, under probation and parole and pretrial systems alone. Um, and uh, people who are on EM, as we call it, are have even stricter geographic boundaries. You know, you're often wearing an ankle bracelet, or you have an app on your phone that's tracking you, that determines exactly where you are.
Hmm.
And if you stray outside of those boundaries, or even sometimes if you don't, but the technology fails and decides you're outside of those boundaries, you can be put in prison or put in jail. And we've heard of people being violated for going to the pharmacy or going to the doctor while they're on an electronic monitor. People who are, trying to seek abortion care in another state are going to face especially uphill battles if they're on an ankle monitor.
Yeah, I mean, and it's, I mean, it also sort of raises a subsidiary issue here as well, which is, the whole system of probation and parole, and the whole concept of electronic monitoring. And I think, obviously, especially electronic monitoring, the perception is like, these people are unsafe, and well, if we track them everywhere, we'll be able to prevent them from ever doing anything. But I mean, what do we know about these systems in terms of their actual role in, at least the way they're presented in terms of their public safety efficacy, quote unquote?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it, because it's a big part of why we're doing this research, because we'd like to bring attention to the difficulties that people face when they're on probation and parole generally. Um, I think I should start by saying that many people say, I would rather go to prison. I'd rather take a prison term, or go to jail, than be on probation or parole. The reason being that these systems often set people up to fail.
Mm.
Nationally, people on probation have to comply with anywhere from 18 to 20 requirements per day. People on parole often face similar requirements, and these can be things, as we've discussed in previous research at our organization. I mean, these are things like, having to maintain employment, having to maintain housing, um, having to go to meetings with your officer on a regular basis. You're forced to pay fees, and in many places, if you don't keep up with your fee payments, you can be reincarcerated for that. And the upshot of this is not to help public safety, right? These aren't programs that are helping society, especially when you consider the impact of destabilizing and putting immense pressure on, nationally, millions of people who are already in precarious positions financially and socially. Um, it actually does the exact opposite of support public safety. If there are people, when we have social disorder in our communities, when we have public safety issues, when we have public health issues, we need to be responding to those with an expansion of healthcare, expansions of critical needs like housing, as opposed to putting people under this intense surveillance.
Yeah, no, I think that's an extraordinarily well put point. And one thing that, I mean, maybe seems obvious to some people, but maybe I think deserves to be discussed a little bit is, I mean, this just feels like it layers on to the very specific aspects of the criminalization of women in the criminal legal system, in the prison system. I mean, access to pregnancy care, all these different things, separation from families. I mean, this just seems to add even one more layer to, I think, obviously we talk a lot about mass incarceration, but, the experience of women in particular that I think doesn't get as much focus, in terms of the mainstream narrative about, what it really is like to be engaged with these carceral systems.
Yeah, that's very well put, and I think that women who are, I said this a second ago, but women who are going to be impacted by this double whammy of probation and parole restrictions and abortion restrictions are, I believe, some of the people who were perhaps the intended, target demographic of abortion restrictions in the first place, right? People of color, people who are poor, right? There is the impact of these systems on already marginalized people really can't be overstated. Um, and when it comes to the justice system and the way that well, again, as you said, the legal system treats women in particular, this is an extension of things like the war on drugs and broken windows policing, the way that those terrible policy turns in our society have brought so many more women um, into the into the probation and parole systems, and thrown them in prison and jail. Um, we've seen, and for many years the population of women in prison was growing faster than the population of men. That's not true anymore, but we still have 200,000 women who are locked up in this country on any given
Mm.
day. Um, and that's a number that we could easily be reducing by doing things like decriminalizing drugs and changing the way that we police our communities.
Well, and you're speaking to it here, but I mean, I think for people who are maybe hearing this for the first time or just starting to look into this, I mean, what can we at least start to do to reduce the impact, the negative impact that policies like this are having?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that the what we're trying to bring attention to with research like this is the harms of the overuse, or maybe I can just say the use of probation and parole. People should be aware in their states of the ways that these systems are impacting people, and people should not, in cases where, for instance, programs like electronic monitoring are introduced as an alternative to incarceration. In counties, and this is happening a lot, where local officials say we're going to decrease the jail population by allowing more people to go on probation or pretrial release with an electronic monitor. People should be aware of just how harmful that's going to be and push back. Um, uh, Lots and lots of folks who are under these systems have that pose absolutely no public safety threat. There's no reason for them to be on supervision at all, and it's going to ruin their life. And I'm sorry to be so doomy about it, but I really think that happens to a lot of people, and the data do in fact show that. So um, you know it, that's something that people can take action on in their communities, is not to accept mass surveillance, and in particular electronic monitoring, as an acceptable alternative to mass incarceration.
Yeah, no, it's very well put, and I think an extraordinarily important point and really, really important research. So, hats off to the Prison Policy Initiative. Wanda Bertram, spokesperson with PPI, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Oh, thank you so much. Take care.
Mhm.